Hi there everyone, welcome to this week's video where we're going to be discussing Karl Marx and Jean-Paul Sartre on alienation. Now these are two, I think, really interesting and important readings for us to do together in the history of philosophy. One of the central themes that we've discussed a lot in our class up to this point has been death, and in particular, the fear of death as one way that you can kind of, mistakenly ruin or squander your, as Epicurus might say, your precious time here on earth, right? And so this week, I want to talk about a kind of complementary, thing that can happen to you that might diminish the value of your life, and that is described as alienation. I think that Marx and Sartre provide really interesting and provocative ideas about what it means to be alienated, which we might also just think about as being disconnected, as having no relationship to yourself or to your work, or a kind of dysfunctional relationship to these things. A lot of contemporary media actually focuses on alienation. If you've ever watched something like Office Space or Fight Club or something like this, right? These are movies that often depict, people sort of in everyday, often white collar jobs. They have no relationship to their work and therefore a large part of their identity. And much of the movie takes place in terms of the main character attempting to resolve this inadequate kind of relationship that you can have to your work and to your labor. And so, obviously, of course, we don't need to go as far as agreeing with Karl Marx about everything, but I nonetheless believe that it can be very interesting for us to pay attention to some of his accounts of what he conceives of as sort of the meaninglessness of labor, because these criticisms have been important not only for radical left-wing communist accounts of civil society, but even moderate, liberal, conservative, etc. accounts of what's wrong with the kind of society that we live in today. So let's begin by discussing Karl Marx in the short a selection of this work, the 1844 manuscripts on 1844 philosophical and economic manuscripts. These are a document of Karl Marx sort of beginning in his early stage of thinking about class struggle, about political economy, detailing what he thinks to be the sort of like moral wrongness of capitalist labor relationships. Now, Marx's thesis is that workers, and we'll come to a more definite understanding of what this term means in just a moment, are alienated under capitalist labor relationships, right? So the idea is that if your society is organized such that almost all of your economic activity goes into making a profit, then the workers in this economy will have no relationship to the work that they are hired to do. And if you've ever had, I don't know, dissatisfying jobs or something like that, then I think this aspect of Marx's consideration can speak to you, even if you don't want to accept any communist blah, 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 right? For example, I've worked at Walmart, I've worked at Domino's, I've worked at liquor stores around Albuquerque. And so, I have had my fair share. I've had office jobs that were essentially call center jobs, you know what I mean? So I've had my fair share of experiences where, I had to work, sometimes up to 60 hours a week or something like that, right? And I had no real relationship with the product of my labor, right? It wasn't like I worked at a liquor store because I was really passionate about booze or something like that, or I worked at Walmart because I really, really enjoyed being a cashier. No, these were things that I did because I needed money for rent, right? And this is the relationship that we very often have to our jobs in capitalist economy. If you look at a lot of jobs where you're, kind of doing what you love, right? You're following your passion. Many of the times you will actually be exploited more for this fact, right? People that are artists, for example, know that it is incredibly difficult to make a living as an artist. And so we prize and jobs that we can see the output of our work as in some way a reflection of ourselves, because the vast majority of jobs, this is not what takes place. And in Marx's early work, this is central to what he takes to be his criticism of capitalist society. And so let's go through some key terms for understanding the nature of Marx's critique here. So to begin with, Marx is always interested in what he calls a class analysis. So the way that Marx thinks about class is that Marx just thinks about labor, right? So, there's a store, there's Walmart, for example, right? And part of the operation of Walmart is a distribution of labor. There are some people that do certain kinds of work, there are other people that do other kinds of work, right? And so on, right? And so Marx's basic point in saying that we live in a class society is to say that there are generally two totally different kinds of roles that are operative in the kind of society in which we live. And those roles are what Marx calls the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, right? So the proletariat is the worker. These are people who have to sell their labor on a market, right? So, Walmart realizes, for example, that you are not probably looking for a job there because you're particularly passionate about their company values or something like that, right? But because you need a paycheck, and you need a paycheck to pay rent, to buy food, to live, right? And so Marx's idea is that in capitalist society, the vast, vast majority of people are in the situation of needing to work to live, and as a consequence, selling their labor on a market. Now, this form of social organization, where there's a bunch of laborers kind of waiting around for somebody to, pay them to work, right? These conditions did not always exist. These conditions began to exist during urbanization and the Industrial Revolution around mostly the 19th century, but, slightly before and after. I mean, obviously after. Yeah. And so, like in ancient Rome, for example, there wasn't a bunch of people like hanging out, like waiting for like a factory owner to like hire them on the spot. No, it's actually like when the state starts taking over huge amounts of agricultural land, rural land, right? People are driven to the city and they are now dependent on the ability to work at a factory in order to feed their family and so on. This was certainly the case in the specific period of capitalism in which Marx was writing, right? The very beginning of the Industrial Revolution. And so there's this vast majority of people who are proletarianized, who are forced to sell their labor on a market. And who are they selling it to? Well, they're selling it to the owners of the factories, right? They're selling it to what Marx calls the owners of the means of production. And this is the class that he calls the bourgeoisie, right? So, if you're Jeff Bezos, for example, you don't need to think about selling your labor on a market in order to live. Why? Because the capital that you already own, namely like Amazon, obviously Jeff Bezos is not the sole owner of Amazon, right? But he has an enormous stake in it, makes enough money such that you would never have to sell your labor on a market in the way that other people do. And so Marx thinks that every kind of social organization is defined in part by class relationships. And what defines the class relationships of capitalism is the contradiction between the interests of the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. In so Marx terms alienation the sort of like natural product of this relationship, right? So like if you're an immiserated factory worker in early industrial England, for example, you are looking to work at any factory that will take you. So you're indifferent as to whether you're making pins and needles. You're indifferent to whether you're working at a sewing factory, whether you're interested in art or music, whatever. It doesn't matter, right? The way that labor is organized is not that you get to pick what would be like the most exciting or whatever profession for you, but instead that it's determined by the economic interests of the people who own the factories and therefore get to make the shots, and that is the bourgeoisie, right? And so in a way it's important for you to not get attached to whatever it is that you're producing, because it might be more profitable for the factory owner to change what it is that they produce, right? It's not up to you what you produce, it's up to them. And so Marx believes that this produces a kind of fundamental antagonism between the interests of the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, and this is one of the central contradictions of capitalism as an economic system, right? Is that it pits one huge class of the population, right, against a small number of owners, and it imposes a kind of existential harm on the workers that's known as alienation. So now let's, having now kind of introduced what causes alienation, describe alienation in more depth, right? And so as a consequence of capitalist economic relations, workers are alienated from, we could say, firstly, the product of their labor. So you go through the big long process, right? You make something, and you are not the owner of the thing that you created. You probably did not play any role in the design of this thing. To understand what a monumental change in human social organization this is, right? Consider what it would be like to be like a shoemaker, a cobbler in the Middle Ages. If you were a shoemaker or a cobbler, this would be your profession for life. You would do it for the rest of your life. You would be the main person, probably locally in your city or province, that does this, and you would have personal relationships to all of your customers, all of the people around you. You would not only have a relationship to your shoes and therefore be able to take pride in your shoes, but you would also have a knowledge bank of how to make these shoes. Something probably that you got from your, mother or father or whatever, probably a father if we're talking about medieval Europe, right? And this has probably been transmitted down your family line for quite a long time, right? Hence, many last names are, in fact, or especially European last names, are professions, right? And the way that things worked for very, very long time in human history is that for the most part, while there was some degree of, professional flexibility and ability to transition between classes and so on, this was rare. For the most part, the expectation would be that you would do the same thing that your parents did, and the family would be a means of sort of professionally training you to be ready to be a worker, right? So that was kind of the relationship under feudalism. But fast forward now, whereas there you would define your family in terms of your work. Now, here, the product of your labor might be something totally insignificant, right? You might be working at a factory that makes pins for other factories, right? You have no relationship to any kind of finished product at all, but continue to make simply materials for other factories to continue to process and utilize. And so obviously, you have no relationship to this work, especially relative to the way that, a worker in the Middle Ages might have a relationship to their work, where it would be the foundation of their family and their professional and economic lives as a whole. Relatedly, right, if you're a cobbler, in the Middle Ages, you probably set a schedule for yourself. You probably didn't have a boss, unless that boss was something like the person training you, so probably your father, and so on, right? And your labor was, at least to some degree, free in the sense that you were able to determine it as economic agent, right? As the sole producer of this kind of shoes, right? You could do it, obviously, according to the economic demands that are available to you, but also with the degree of flexibility that related to your own schedule, right? And so in that way, you could really think about your work and your family life as being connected. You can schedule around your family. You can, make your family a priority such that your family comes first and your work can come second, right? But in early industrial England, that is not the case. Especially during the early Industrial Revolution, hours were incredibly brutal. It took a very long time for there to be legislation that regulated the amount of time that you could work at once. There used to be child labor, right? And so here, the bourgeoisie wants to control the process of labor itself in order to produce a profit. To continue our comparison, right, the workers under capitalism are also alienated from their distinctive knowledge. If a cobbler family in the Middle Ages would pass down the knowledge of how to make their particular brand of shoes for generations, then in capitalist economic systems, when you're mass producing things through industrial factories, well, the knowledge really resides for those who knows how to use the machinery, which is the bourgeoisie. And oftentimes, too, what would have been sort of working knowledge that belonged to the worker is now at the capitalist whim, right? So, like, I didn't learn how to make pizzas or whatever whenever I worked at Domino's. I learned how to use the machinery that was already out of Domino's, right? And so it's not like I could bring any of that knowledge that I was gaining home with me. It's not like I really learned how to make a really great pizza working at Domino's, but instead I simply learned how to maneuver the equipment provided to me as efficiently as possible. And that is what the bourgeoisie or the capitalist is interested in you knowing, right? Because that makes you easily replaceable. Finally, another one of Marx's points is that this way of framing labor relationship also alienates workers from one another. So, when there are very, very limited spots for, say, this new job or whatever that has a higher salary, then I now have to view all of my fellow workers, right, co-workers, whatever, as potential competition. Right? They are now positioned to be a threat to my well-being. Instead of, us forming a cooperative community and working together and whatnot, right? We're not only alienated from ourselves and from our work, we're also become alienated from one another. And finally, Marx will often say that this kind of alienation is an alienation from our species being. In other words, what Marx is trying to say here is that this alienates us from what it means to be a human being. which for Marx is to be a socially laboring animal. We do labor, we produce things, and we do it together. And because capitalist labor relationships alienate us from so many aspects of what we could define as or describe as natural labor relationships, we get further and further from our own sense of shared humanity with one another. Now, of course, we don't need to accept, once again, that this means we need to overthrow capitalism or something like that, although that is the, what Marx concludes. We might think that, perhaps we can address this sort of problem whereby workers are alienated from their labor and they don't feel any connection with the work that they're doing within a capitalist frame, right? Or perhaps there are some regulations or something else that can help with this situation, right? Okay, now also I want to talk about Jean-Paul Sartre. I'm going to try to keep this somewhat brief because I think that there's a lot of significant continuity that we can trace with Marx. Sartre was himself a Marxist and thought that this text was very important to him. So, it's not really surprising that we would read them together. Now, Sartre is famous for being maybe like the maybe most famous existentialist, we could say, right? He was, unlike many other people that we would identify as existentialists, simply willing to accept the label existentialism, right? And so Sartre's views are interesting. I hope the camera will focus. I don't know why the camera's focusing. Hopefully it fixes itself at some point. But Sartre's main claim is that existence precedes essence. This is what he takes to be the definition, in a certain way, of existentialism. Now, existence and essence, these are $2 words, if there ever was any, right? So let's try to define them a little bit more. What Sartre is trying to say is that many people think that there is something like their own essence, right? The thing that they were meant to do, the purpose they were meant to fulfill, right? And this they think of as being their real, true identity, right? So, for example, if you're religious and you believe in the existence of God, right, you might think that God created some station for you, which is your position in life, and that this constitutes in an important way your essence, right? This is what you're meant to do. This is what God intended, and so on, right? And in this case, your essence would precede your existence, right? God had a plan for you, and, you then were able to fulfill that role or not, right? Sartre claims that existentialism at its core is atheistic. So it involves a denial that there's anything like God, right? There's anything that like transcends our own world that determines the purpose for it. To the contrary, what Sartre wants to say is that we determine the purpose of the world after we have lived within it. So in other words, purpose is not something that we find, say in God's mind or something like that before we ever existed, but instead, in an important way, our essence, what is most significant and essential to our own well-being, comes from ourselves. It comes from the fact that we exist. So existence precedes essence in the precise sense that as a free being, right, you exist in the world, you decide what's important to you, and then you have a purpose. But you don't have a purpose that pre-exists you, right, that is indifferent to whether you exist or not, and, is just kind of waiting around for you to fulfill its purpose. To the contrary, Sartre's point, and the point of existentialism, is to say that you are, in an important sense, condemned to be free. What do they mean by that? Well, it means that even when you don't want to, even when it's uncomfortable or difficult or uncertain, you are in the position where you are responsible for what you decide is important. You, in other words, decide through your actions what you think is really right and really valuable. Now, Sartre's purpose in this short speech that he gave, Existentialism is a Humanism, is to try to argue that this conception of human beings and their role in the world is consistent with what he calls human values or human dignity, right? So if you are a conservative religious person and you hear Sartre claim that existence precedes essence, right, or that there is no overarching overall importance, right, to what you're doing, well, they might just say, they would react to this by thinking, well, you're just saying that nothing matters. Right? You're saying that we can go out in the world and we can do whatever we want and we can act immorally and we can screw other people over and ultimately none of it matters because nothing matters. This is how Sartre was very often interpreted and how people still think about existentialism, at least to some extent, today. So Sartre's purpose is to refute these people, to show that existentialism is actually a way of affirming the importance of certain kinds of human values, like freedom, for example. And so some key terms that I've written here, right, first is nihilism. So nihil means nothing, and so nihilism is just the view that nothing matters. Right? And so Sartre is being accused of nihilism, but importantly, he denies that he is a nihilist or that existentialism results in nihilism. The second key term that I have here is essentialism. Now, essentialism refers to the belief, contrary to existentialism, that there is a transcendent purpose for human beings, right? So you might think there's like an essence to being a woman or something like that, right? And people can fulfill that role or they can fail to fulfill that role. And so Sartre is rejecting essentialism in favor of existentialism. Now, existence, right, is what he says precedes essence. So in other words, we're thrown into the world. We don't choose what the world is like. We don't choose to be here. We don't choose to be free beings. But when we are here, we are endowed with a kind of radical freedom and responsibility, which is that we now interpret the world and are reflections, in a certain sense, of the world. And so Sartre believes that this freedom can be so overwhelming that we want to deny it. It causes us, he says, a lot of anguish, right, to realize that we're free and we're responsible for the kind of world that we live in a certain sense, even though we didn't choose it, that we often seek to evade this responsibility by making ourselves merely into a kind of object, right? So, you know, this is sort of the excuse of like, I'm just following orders, right? I didn't choose to do whatever in my job or whatever in my professional life, but I'm merely following the dictates of someone else, and so on. And so for Sartre, this is kind of bad faith, right? We might think about alienation as related to bad faith, right? We start to think that we are our job or that other people are their jobs, right? Instead of they're always free beings that are more than their circumstances, right? Hence the importance of freedom as a theme. Now, the last little bit that I have here, I find interesting because I'm really curious to think about the overlaps between this aspect of Sartre and Kant. And this is Sartre's claim that the reason why existentialism is a humanism is because when you decide for yourself, you decide for all of mankind. So this should remind you of what we just discussed in the Kant unit, where Kant says that you should only act in such a way that you could will it to be a universal law. You could will your maxim should become universal law. Here too, we get this idea that when you decide for yourself, you're deciding for everyone, right? But the core difference is that whereas Kant thinks that the source of morality comes from something transcendent, right, something that's not us, but that he calls pure reason or something like that, Sartre locates the source of this authority in our own self-conception. So in other words, I have to act morally because I see that as being part of the world that I'm seeking to create. So for example, when I'm a teacher, right, I'm not deciding for myself that everyone else should be a teacher or something like that. That's absurd, right? Clearly, Sartre doesn't mean something as silly as this, right? So what does he mean? Well, he means that when you decide to be a teacher, for example, you have certain kinds of values that serve as something like motivators for that behavior, right? You think that we should live in a world where everyone receives an education, right? And that is important to you, hence you dedicate yourself to teaching. So when you're deciding for all of mankind, right, you're not deciding that they should do the specific thing that you did or something like that, but you are projecting your values into the future and trying to realize them in the world. And you're working to create, for example, as a teacher, a world in which everyone can receive an education. And similarly, when you decide to do anything else, right, you are affirming the values that underlie your behavior. And this commits you to broad moral goals, right? It's not like your interests are on some island and this is what's important, everyone else's interests don't matter. But when you choose for yourself to live with self-respect and integrity and so on, right, you are implicitly stating those as values not only for yourself, but for everyone, for all of mankind. So even though we are self-determining in an important respect, this self-determination doesn't just mean, oh, you should do whatever you want. It doesn't matter. You can totally murder people or whatever. But to the contrary, that you are radically responsible for the values that underlie your behavior that you bring into the world. I'm very interested in hearing what you all think about this unit, and I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.